Welcome to Zion Fellowship's Bible Wire. In these podcasts, we discuss what the Bible says, line upon line and precept upon precept. Today, Tom Brennan will be beginning our study on the book of 1 John. Settle in for the next few minutes and learn more about who God is and how He loves.
Well, hi, this is Tom Brennan. I am going to be addressing the book of 1 John. It's an epistle, otherwise known as a letter, if that is a little bit different language for you if you're new. And we're going to be looking at this. And my background is primarily as a CAD teacher. I teach AutoCAD. I've taught CAD in many, many different places, and I've also taught the Bible in many, many different places. So this is obviously a little different approach than teaching AutoCAD. So if I wind up talking about Pythagoras and angles and polygons, you'll have to forgive me. But I think I can stay away from it for this particular lesson. So anyway, let's jump into it. So we're talking about the Gospel of John. And the writer of that gospel is what we're really talking about, because this is an epistle that he wrote. So you kind of have to consider them both together, because here's the thing. When you're talking about authors typically have a certain kind of a style, a certain kind of a bend, a certain kind of a set of experiences. And so when you hear that, you have to kind of take it all in. So therefore, the Gospel of John just permeates this epistle, 1 John. And so what we're going to do right now as we look at this, we're going to be in this study, we're going to be talking about the first epistle of John, and along with it are the two smaller ones, second and third. We'll tack those on at the very end, but for right now, we're going to be concentrating on 1 John. So the first thing I want to point out is give some introductory work, because when we talk about this particular book, it's not a long book, but this book is very, very deep, and it also is one of those books that is not really linear. Okay, Paul, when you read Paul is kind of almost like listening to Bach. You know, if you ever listen to Bach is very, very almost mathematical when you listen to bump, 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 then this counterpoint thing. And John is so different. John comes across like staccato, like bang, 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 this is that. And he comes across with a very different approach. And so therefore, when you're studying the book of 1 John, or even the Gospel of John for that matter, you got to kind of look at it a little bit differently. But let's talk about why John wrote the book. So we're going to start with some introduction. Today's lesson is going to be divided between what the background information is that is important to understanding this lesson and getting into the prologue. So we're going to work on those things right now. So the first thing is I want to bring out 1 John 4:16, and this is kind of a key verse, and it says, "And we have come to know and have believed the love that God has for us. God is love." Now, you can't beat that. I, as a young believer, when I first became a believer, I was introduced to no less than 4 different songs that we used to sing in worship that came out of the actual book of 1 John. Okay, that's one of them I just quoted right there. So the Gospel of John, it's the longest of these 3 letters. It's the most distinctive, okay? So 1 John, it's almost like a greatest hits album. There's a number of verses and statements in 1 John that stand on their own, apart from any context, such as I could say, God is light. It's a quote right out of 1 John. I could say God is love, quote right out of 1 John. God is life, quote right out of 1 John. And you don't really need anything besides those to actually understand where he's going. So that's what John is. And so John is very direct. He's very clear on this. But this is the epistle about how you can be sure of your salvation. The book is written for a purpose, and this purpose is revealed in 2 different places. In 1 John 1:4, he says that your joy may be full. And in 1 John 5:13, "These things I have written to you which believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life, and that you may continue to believe in the name of the Son of God." So 2 purposes, one for full joy, and the other one is to have assurance of salvation. So there's a clear emphasis on knowing in this letter. Assurance is an important theme in this book, and he exhorts them, as he's giving this message, to stand fast to the message that they first believed. And he draws a distinction between truth and error, sin and righteousness, light and darkness. So in this sense, he is a very his approach is one of actually great extremes, which is very different. There's no gray area in here. Everything is just like, it's this or it's that. A lot of contrasts. And so this is one thing as I'm rolling this out is kind of interesting because we've all been introduced to John as the disciple of love, the love disciple. Hey, John's lovey-dovey. He's okay with that. Oh, really? Well, then why is he saying people that don't believe what we believe are antichrist? Why is he saying anyone who doesn't bring this doctrine is a liar? Well, he's also a son of thunder. Let's not forget that. John was the son of thunder. And so he actually could come, and he thunders in this book. He kind of goes between this loving fatherly approach and then also these stark warnings. So we have that going on here. So he wrote this gospel to prove the deity of Christ. He writes his letters, the epistles, to prove the humanity of Christ. And the gospel was to prove the deity of Christ. So these were heresies that were both going on at the time. So this book's unusual. The background information is so significant and impacts our understanding so greatly, we must look into the who, the what, the why, the when, and how to get a handle on this. So the author already said that it is John, the apostle. Now, John has traditionally been understood to be the apostle John, one of the 12. So that's the author. That's what we're looking at right now. There has been some argument as to whether that's the case or not, but there always is. There's always some criticism that says, oh, well, it's not this or that. But we're taking it that he is there, that's who it is. And he is now an old man. And he continues to build the church as an evangelist and encourage believers as a shepherd. There is a tradition when John was older and in attendance at church meetings, he would always be given the opportunity to speak before anybody else due to his closeness to Jesus himself. He would always rise and say the same thing. I have a message from the Lord. Love each other. Now, of course, that's a legend. We don't know, but it's a tradition, and it certainly does fit in with everything else that we read here. The similarities between the Gospel of John and these three epistles are strong enough that the authorship has consistently understood to be John. There's always disputes about authorship, but for these books, they're more of a subtext because they're not as convincing, okay? So I want to just kind of point something out here about this, and that when we talk about the author of this particular book, there's an old saying in music that the singer is more important than the song. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, the thing is, there's some truth to that. When you hear a certain singer, they can sing some things and they couldn't sing other things. Now, give me an example. Here's an example, Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash actually sang this line, I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. All right, now, and you believe him. When Johnny Cash sings that, you believe him. Now, imagine Michael Bublé singing that line. Would you be as convinced that Michael Bublé is of that same kind of character? And the answer is no, you're not going to do that. So the message matters, but the messenger also matters. And in this case, the messenger is John the Apostle who knew Jesus. So the message is still the main thing, but the writer is important. Consider the impact of The Chosen. This is the first ever multi-season series about the life of Christ. If you've not seen it, I encourage you to. It's a free show that tens of millions of people won't stop talking about. And why has it had such an impact? It brings us into close contact with Jesus and those who knew him, and we all crave this closer knowledge and intimacy with Jesus. And John arguably was closer than anybody on the planet, so much so that I named my firstborn son John because of that. And I'm not the only one who's been impacted by the life of John. So there's all this external evidence that points to the Apostle John as the author. Irenaeus, who was one of the church fathers, he attributed it to John. Tertullian, Clement, Origen, they all did. They all said that was the case. And then there's this internal evidence, because as you're an apostle, what are you going to say? So first of all, he comes across as an eyewitness to these events. That's probably the biggest thing. He saw it. He saw what was going on here. So he was an eyewitness. He knew what it was. And as he talks about it, you can see there's this sense of authority. There's a sense of I was there, which is really kind of, you couldn't carry that kind of approach or even say it if you really weren't there, because people would say, you didn't know him. And so it's pretty much taken that the author was an eyewitness for sure. He's got this authoritative tone. He just assumes they're going to listen to what he says. There's going to be, okay, I'm going to say this, and they're going to listen. There's that. The next is there's this assumed familiarity with the reader. So all these things right now are all pointers that actually indicate that we are close to it. And the last thing is the relationship of 1 John to the fourth gospel. There's actually some areas where the style, the vocabulary, and even structure between these two actually is so similar. Okay, so we got that. Now, the location. Where was this book written? It's always good to know that. And the the basic thought is that it was written in Ephesus. That's what the earliest evidence points to. John spent a lot of time there. And it is also thought that not only was John based in Ephesus, that he wrote this letter to the same churches that he mentions in the book of Revelation. There's 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation. John wrote that book too. So the thought is that 1 John was actually written and circulated to those churches. Now, another thing about this is the setting. Why was the book written? And part of it was the setting was written largely to deal with an issue they were having right now. So he's got this familiarity with the recipients. You can clearly see that. He has a fatherly tone. He calls them my little children. He comes with authority. And then he brings out this very strong warning against false teachers. And then he addresses a church split. So he knew what was going on. So there was this church split going on as well. And church splits, are painful no matter when you go through them. Doctrinal controversy, us against them. He actually says, we do this, they do that, kind of a thing. And so there's a lot of things that are going on here. And then he also talks about these false teachers coming in and just really messing with his children, with the believers who come into the faith. And so we have this. It's really something. And so as you read into this right now, John is coming across with warnings. So it's interspersed. It kind of like talks about my little children, walk in love. And then he says, and those people over there are antichrists. So it's this. There's quite a dichotomy as you read the book of John. So there's a few things that John discusses that he's getting into. First of all, the people that he is having an issue with are denying his authority, and they're actually splitting the church. There's also Gnosticism, which is a big part of what we have going on right here. So that is part of what this whole thing is that there's this Gnosticism that was just everywhere right there, and it actually downplayed the death of Christ on the cross. So John's coming at it because he saw Jesus die, and he's coming across with a lot of authority. Now, the next thing is we're going to talk about Gnosticism just briefly because it's a part of what we're going to be dealing with here. So Gnosticism is the opposite of agnosticism. So we've all heard of agnostics. What's an agnostic say? An agnostic says, well, I don't know. There's not enough evidence. I don't get it. I just don't know enough. They're not atheists. They're agnostics. I just don't know. Well, a Gnostic says, well, I do know. And what they knew was they had this secret knowledge, kind of like Gandalf, at the mines of Moria, speak, friend, and enter, and he's got this secret knowledge, except he didn't in that particular case. And neither did the Gnostics. They really didn't know either. So anyway, Gnosticism was influenced by such philosophers as Plato and advocated a dualism that basically says matter is evil and the spirit is good. And a result of this idea, these false teachers, although they attributed some form of deity to Christ, they denied his true humanity to preserve him from evil. So you've got that right there, and that's problematic right away. To say that Jesus rose spiritually, and which was being talked about back then, and he was just a spirit being and so forth, because the physical is all evil, that was absolutely, completely outside of John's understanding because he saw Jesus die. He leaned on his breast. He heard the holy heartbeat. So John's coming against that. Instead of divine revelation standing as judge over man's ideas judge God's revelation. That's the whole thought right here, is that the heresy features 2 basic forms. First, some physical reality of Jesus by reminding his readers. There was a physical reality of Jesus by reminding his readers that he was an eyewitness to asserting that Jesus' physical body was not real, but only seemed to be physical. So one of the errors that John is addressing here is that they said, well, he just seemed to be dead. He just seemed to be here. And so John's coming across with this thought that, no, absolutely not. He was here and I saw him. So these views destroy the meaning of the gospel, and they destroy the actual message that John's coming across with right here. The structure of John is that John is very different. It's not a letter in the classic Pauline format. We've looked at the book of Galatians, and it's more of a poetic sermon or a tract. It's written with strong contrasts. Also, the thought is that it's kind of more like a spiral. It kind of talks about some ideas and keeps on going around those ideas. So rather than a linear thought by thought by thought, this and then that and this and then that, it's a spiral. It keeps on going along the same thoughts. And the outline we're going to look at for this right now is that God is light, God is love, and that God is life. Those are the 3 big things that we're going to be looking for. And so that is as much as we're going to be able to cover for today. We'll pick it up next time, and we'll continue talking about this beautiful book and get into the prologue, and we'll continue on with that.
We have reached the end of today's Bible Wire podcast. If you'd like more information about our church, or if you'd like more resources related to this podcast, you can find us online at www.zionfellowship.net. We're also available on social media. Look for Zion Fellowship. Thank you for joining us today on Bible Wire.